The winter wind cut through the threadbare cloth wrapped around her shoulders like a blade through paper. She had no name that mattered. The ranch hands called her Girl when they bothered to address her at all. And Silas Cartwright, the man who owned her, simply pointed and grunted his commands. At 19, she had already lived lifetimes of servitude, her hands scarred from kitchen burns and endless labor, her spirit worn thin as the fabric that barely kept the cold from her bones. The Cartwright Ranch sprawled across a desolate stretch of Wyoming territory, where the summer sun could crack a man's lips in hours and winter storms could bury a rider and his horse in minutes. It was 1887, and the harsh land showed no mercy to those who worked it, least of all to those who worked it without choice, without pay, without hope of anything better. She rose before dawn each morning, as she had for the past 3 years since Cartwright had purchased her from a traveling trader. The transaction had been as simple and brutal as buying livestock. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and she became property, her previous life. Whatever fragments she could still remember felt like stories told about someone else. A mother's voice singing lullabies, the smell of fresh bread, the feeling of being loved. All of it seemed as distant as the stars that wheeled overhead in the endless prairie sky. This particular December morning brought with it the promise of a blizzard. The air held that peculiar stillness that preceded violent weather, and even the hardy ranch horses stood restless in their stalls. Cartwright had been drinking since noon the day before, his temper growing fouler with each passing hour. When she had accidentally knocked over a pitcher while serving his dinner, his backhand had sent her sprawling across the kitchen floor, her cheek blooming with a bruise that would last for weeks. "Clumsy wretch," he had snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Can't even serve a meal without making a mess. Get out of my sight before I give you something to really cry about." She had learned long ago not to cry where he could see. Tears only made him angrier, more violent. Instead, she had picked herself up, cleaned the broken pottery, and retreated to the tiny space behind the kitchen that served as her quarters, barely large enough for a straw mattress and a wooden crate that held her few belongings. Now, in the gray light of dawn, she wrapped herself in every scrap of cloth she could find and stepped out into the bitter cold. The water barrel by the kitchen had frozen solid again, which meant another trip to the creek that wound through the rocky hills behind the ranch. Cartwright would be furious if there wasn't fresh water for his morning coffee, and his fury was something she could ill afford to face again so soon. The old wooden buckets bit into her palms even through the rags she had wrapped around her hands. The path to the creek was treacherous in good weather, but winter had turned it into a maze of ice-slicked rocks and hidden crevices. She had made this journey hundreds of times, but today something felt different. The usual landmarks seemed shifted, distorted by the strange quality of light that preceded a storm. 20 minutes into her climb, she realized she had taken a wrong turn. The familiar creek was nowhere to be seen, and the rocky outcropping she had been using as a guide looked nothing like she remembered. Panic fluttered in her chest like a caged bird. Getting lost in weather like this could mean death, and even if she survived, Cartwright's rage at her failure would be worse than freezing. She pressed on, hoping to find some recognizable feature that would guide her back to the right path. The wind was picking up now, driving tiny crystals of ice against her exposed skin like needles. Her feet, wrapped in boots that had belonged to a ranch hand who had died the previous spring, were beginning to lose feeling. It was then that she saw the cave. The opening was partially hidden by an overhang of rock and a screen of ice-covered scrub brush. She might have missed it entirely if not for the strange sound that drifted from within, a rhythmic clanking, like metal striking metal. Her first instinct was to run. Caves in these mountains could shelter bears, wolves, or worse, the kind of desperate men who had fled civilization and embraced the brutal law of the wilderness. But the cold was seeping through her bones, and the sound, whatever its source, suggested the presence of something human rather than animal. She crept closer, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The cave mouth was wider than it had appeared from a distance. easily large enough for a man to walk through upright. The clanking sound continued, irregular but persistent, echoing off stone walls somewhere in the darkness beyond. She hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and face the certain punishment of returning late, rather than the unknown dangers that might lurk in the shadows. Then she heard something else, a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was human, unmistakably so. Not quite a groan, not quite a sigh, but the sound a person makes when they are in pain and trying not to show it. Against every grain of sense she possessed, she stepped into the cave. The darkness was complete after the first few feet, but the sounds grew clearer. Metal against stone, the soft scrape of movement, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of breathing. Human breathing. She felt along the rough stone wall with one hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cave curved to the left, and suddenly there was light ahead, not sunlight, but the dim glow of what might have been a small fire, or perhaps just reflected daylight from some other opening. She moved toward it, step by careful step. What she found in that flickering half-light would haunt her dreams and change her life forever. He sat with his back against the far wall of the cave, and even in the poor light, she could see that he was massive. His shoulders were broad enough to fill a doorway, his arms thick with the kind of muscle that came from years of hard labor. His hair and beard were wild, unkempt, streaked with gray that suggested he was no longer young. But it was the chains that made her gasp aloud. Iron shackles encircled his wrists and ankles, connected by lengths of rusted chain that had worn grooves in the stone floor where he had moved them over countless days and nights. The metal was old, corroded, but still strong enough to hold him fast. When he moved, the chains created that clanking sound she had heard from outside. At the sound of her gasp, his head snapped up, and she found herself staring into eyes that were neither mad nor savage, as she had expected, but simply tired. So deeply tired that she could feel the weight of it in her own bones. They were pale eyes, gray as winter sky, set in a face that might once have been handsome, but now showed the ravages of years spent in this cold, dark place. For a long moment, neither of them moved. She stood frozen in the cave mouth, her water buckets forgotten at her feet. He sat chained to the wall, studying her with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. Then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse but surprisingly gentle. "You're not one of them." She didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it, without threat, without demand, was so different from any man's voice she had heard in years that it took her breath away. At the Cartwright Ranch, men spoke to her in commands and curses, if they spoke to her at all. This man, chained and imprisoned, spoke to her as if she were a person worthy of conversation. She started, then stopped. Her own voice sounded strange in the echoing space. "I was looking for water. I got lost." He nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "Storm coming. Bad one, by the feel of it. You should get back before it hits." The kindness in his voice, the concern for her welfare when he was clearly the one in desperate circumstances, broke something loose inside her chest. When had anyone last worried about her safety? Who did this to you?" she whispered, gesturing at the chains. His laugh was bitter but not directed at her. "Long story. Too long for a day like this. Go on, girl. Get yourself home safe." But she found herself taking a step closer instead of backing away. In the better light, she could see that he was thinner than his frame suggested he should be. When had he last eaten a proper meal? When had anyone brought him water, or blankets, or even acknowledged that he existed? "How long have you been here?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 10 years. Give or take a season. 10 years. The number hit her like a physical blow. She had been Cartwright's property for 3 years, and it felt like a lifetime. This man had been chained in darkness for more than 3 times that long. Without conscious decision, she found herself moving closer, studying the chains, the makeshift bed of rags and pine needles in one corner, the way he had arranged stones to catch and hold what little warmth the cave could provide. This wasn't the lair of a madman or a savage. This was the careful, desperate work of someone trying to stay human in impossible circumstances. "I have to go," she said finally, though something deep inside her rebelled against the words. "If I'm not back soon, he'll hurt you." It wasn't a question. Somehow, this chained stranger understood exactly what kind of life she lived. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Be careful on the path down. Ice makes it treacherous." She backed toward the cave entrance, her eyes never leaving his face. Those pale gray eyes followed her, not with hunger or threat, but with something that looked almost like regret. "Wait," he called softly as she reached the mouth of the cave. She turned back. "What do they call you?" The question was simple, but it cut straight through to her heart. What did they call her? Girl. Worthless. A dozen other names that had nothing to do with who she might have been before Cartwright owned her. She began, then stopped. The truth was too shameful to speak aloud. "I don't have a name that matters." Something shifted in his expression, a flash of pain that had nothing to do with his chains. "Everyone has a name that matters." She fled then, grabbing her buckets and stumbling back into the gray morning light. But as she picked her way down the treacherous path toward the creek, and then home to face whatever punishment awaited her, she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes or the gentle way he had spoken to her. For the first time in 3 years, someone had talked to her as if she were human. That night, huddled in her tiny space behind the kitchen with fresh bruises blooming where Cartwright had expressed his displeasure at her tardiness, she found herself thinking not about her own pain, but about pale gray eyes and rusted chains. 10 years. The thought wouldn't leave her alone. 3 days passed before she could return to the cave. Silas Cartwright had been in one of his black moods, the kind that came when the whiskey ran low and the bills piled high. He'd kept her busy from dawn to dusk with endless tasks, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, mending clothes that weren't torn, anything to keep her under his watchful, vindictive eye. But on the 4th morning, Providence smiled on her in the form of Cartwright's departure for town. He'd ridden out before sunrise with 2 of his ranch hands, muttering about supplies and debts, leaving explicit instructions for her to have a hot meal waiting when he returned that evening. She had maybe 6 hours. The kitchen yielded its small treasures reluctantly. A handful of hardtack biscuits from the bottom of the barrel, slightly stale but still edible. A piece of salt pork that Cartwright would never miss from his stores. An old wool blanket that had been relegated to the rag pile, torn but still capable of providing warmth. She wrapped everything in a piece of oiled cloth and tucked it under her shawl. The path to the cave was easier to navigate in daylight, though ice still made every step treacherous. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed, not from exertion but from anticipation mixed with fear. What if he wasn't there? What if she had dreamed the entire encounter? What if he was there, but her return had somehow angered him? The cave mouth looked smaller in the full light of morning, less mysterious but somehow more real. She paused at the entrance, listening for the familiar sound of chains, and heard instead something that made her throat tighten with emotion. A voice, low and rough, singing. It was an old song, one her mother had sung to her years ago. The melody drifted from the depths of the cave, wavering and uncertain, as if the singer had forgotten some of the words but remembered the comfort the tune had once provided. She stepped inside, and the singing stopped. "I wondered if you'd come back." His voice came from the shadows. "I brought you something," she said, her words echoing slightly off the stone walls. When she reached the area where pale light filtered in from some hidden crack in the rock, she found him sitting exactly as he had been 3 days earlier. But something was different. He had tried to tidy himself. His hair was combed back with his fingers, his beard somewhat neater. The effort he had made, chained and helpless as he was, touched her more deeply than any grand gesture ever could. "You shouldn't have," he said, but his eyes were fixed on the bundle she carried. "If he finds out—" "He won't." She knelt just outside his reach and unwrapped the food. "He's gone to town." The way he looked at the simple provisions, stale biscuits and a piece of salt pork, was like watching a man see gold. His restraint was visible, physical, as if he were holding himself back from lunging forward. "When did you last eat?" she asked quietly. He considered the question. 2 days, maybe 3. Hard to keep track without seeing the sun regular. She pushed the food closer. "Please." He took a biscuit with hands that shook slightly, and she realized it wasn't just from hunger, but from the simple human kindness of being offered food instead of having scraps thrown at him. He ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the meal might disappear if he moved too quickly. "What's your name?" she asked while he ate. "Calder," he said between careful bites. "Calder Boone. She paused, that familiar shame rising in her throat. "I don't have a proper name anymore." He looked up at her, those pale gray eyes serious. "What did your mother call you?" The question hit her unexpectedly, bringing with it a rush of memories she usually kept buried. "May," she whispered. "She called me May." "May," he repeated, and the name sounded different in his voice, not like a command or a dismissal, but like something precious. "It's a good name." She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and settled more comfortably on the cave floor. "How did you end up here, Mr. Boone?" His laugh was bitter. "You sure you want to hear that story? It's not a pleasant one." "I have time." Calder finished the biscuit and leaned back against the cave wall. For a long moment, he stared at the chains around his wrists as if seeing them for the first time. "I had a ranch once," he began. "Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Worked 10 years to build it up. Had a small herd of cattle, a few good horses. Was fixing to ask a girl named Sarah to marry me." His voice grew quieter. "Had a half-brother too, Thomas, same father, different mothers. Always resented that our daddy left me the land instead of him." May waited, sensing there was more. "One winter, bad one like we've been having. Someone killed a traveling preacher and his wife about 20 miles from my place. Robbed them, left them for dead in the snow. When the law came looking, Thomas told them he'd seen me riding that direction the day it happened. But you weren't. Course I wasn't. Was home the whole time. Sick with fever. But Thomas had friends backing up his story. And Sarah..." He paused, pain flickering across his features. "Sarah said she'd seen me acting strange, violent-like. Said she was afraid of what I might do." May felt something cold settle in her stomach. She lied? Thomas paid her to... Found out later he'd promised to marry her once I was out of the way. Make her mistress of the ranch that should have been his. Calder's chains clinked as he shifted position. "They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me to suffer first." "So they brought you here?" "Had some men drag me up here in the dead of night, chained me up like an animal and left me to die slow. Figured the cold would do their work for them. Save them the trouble of an execution." His smile was grim. "Joke was on them. I'm too stubborn to die easy." May stared at him, trying to imagine the betrayal, the isolation, the slow years of hoping someone would find him while knowing no one was looking. 10 years, she said quietly. 10 years. He agreed. Been a long time since I heard my own name spoke kind. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. May pulled the spare blanket from her bundle and, before she could lose her nerve, moved closer to drape it around his shoulders. He went very still as she leaned near, but didn't pull away. "Why are you doing this?" he asked when she settled back down. The question made her think. Why was she risking Cartwright's fury to help a man she barely knew? "Maybe because nobody ever helped me," she said finally. "Maybe because you're the first person in 3 years to treat me like I'm human." Something shifted in his expression. "What did he do to you? Cartwright?" She shook her head quickly. "It doesn't matter." "It does matter." His voice was firm, but gentle. "You matter, May." The simple declaration hit her like a physical blow. When had anyone last said her name with such conviction? When had anyone suggested that her pain, her story, her very existence had value? "He bought me," she said quietly. "From a man who said he was my uncle. After my parents died, this man came and claimed me. Said he was family. Then when I was 16, he sold me to Cartwright to pay his gambling debts. Calder's chains rattled as his hands clenched into fists. Son of a... He caught himself, jaw working with suppressed rage. What kind of man buys another human being? The kind who thinks some people aren't really people, May said. Same kind who chains a man in a cave for 10 years. They looked at each other across the dim space. Two people who had learned the hard way that the world could be cruel beyond measure, but who had somehow retained enough humanity to recognize it in each other. The old cook at the ranch, May said, breaking the heavy silence. He sometimes talks about the old days. Says this whole area used to be different, wild, but honest wild. Says there was a mountain man who helped people, fought off claim jumpers and cattle rustlers, defended folks who couldn't defend themselves. Calder's eyes sharpened. What else did he say? Said this man got framed for murder by someone who wanted his land. Said he disappeared one winter and nobody ever saw him again. She looked at him meaningfully. Said his name was Boone. Old Seth still working for Cartwright? You know Seth? Saved his life once, maybe 15 years ago. Pack of wolves had him cornered in a ravine, been wondering if he was still alive. Calder's smile was the first genuine one she had seen from him. He always did talk too much. May felt a warmth spread through her chest. Here was proof that Calder had been the man Seth described. A protector, not a killer. He still talks about you sometimes. Says you were the best man he ever knew. Seth's got a romantic view of things, Calder said, but she could see the words meant something to him. I just did what needed doing. What you did was right, May said firmly, and what they did to you was wrong. He studied her face in the dim light. What are we going to do about it? The question hung in the air between them. May realized that somewhere in the past hour, they had become a we, two people bound together by shared pain and the fragile beginning of hope. I don't know, she admitted, but I'll keep coming back, as long as I can. I'll keep bringing you food, blankets, whatever I can manage. May, his voice was serious. If he catches you, he won't catch me. She stood up, brushing dust from her skirt. I've gotten good at being invisible. As she prepared to leave, Calder called her name softly. She turned back. Thank you, he said. Not just for the food, for... He gestured vaguely at the space between them. For seeing me. For reminding me I'm still human. May felt tears prick at her eyes. You did the same for me. The walk back to the ranch passed quickly, her mind full of plans and possibilities. She had found someone who needed her help, someone who treated her with kindness and respect. For the first time in years, she had a purpose beyond mere survival. That night, as she lay on her thin mattress behind the kitchen, she didn't think about Cartwright's cruelty or her own hopeless situation. Instead, she thought about pale gray eyes and a gentle voice asking her name. She thought about chains that could be broken and lies that could be exposed. She thought about Calder Boone. And for the first time since she could remember, she went to sleep with something that felt like hope warming her chest. Tomorrow, she would find a way to help him. Somehow, she would find a way to set them both free. For 2 weeks, May made the treacherous journey to the cave whenever Cartwright's absence allowed. Each visit brought small gifts, a piece of bread here, a worn shirt there, once even a precious bit of soap that she had managed to slip from the kitchen stores. But more than the physical offerings, she brought conversation, human connection, and something neither of them had experienced in years, friendship. Calder began to look forward to her visits with an intensity that surprised him. The sound of her footsteps on the rocky path outside sent his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hope. She would settle on the cave floor with her back against the opposite wall, and they would talk for hours about books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had harbored before the world turned cruel. It was during one of these visits that May first examined his chains closely. The shackles around his wrists had worn grooves in his skin over the years, creating permanent scars that spoke of countless attempts to break free. The iron was old but solid, secured with heavy padlocks that would require keys or considerable force to open. "There has to be a way," she murmured, running her fingers along the chain links. "I've tried everything," Calder said quietly. "Rocks, pieces of metal I found in here, even tried to dislocate my own joints to slip free. The man who chained me knew his business, but May had noticed something he hadn't. The chain attached to his left ankle was secured to an iron ring driven into the cave wall, and while the ring itself was solid, the rock around it showed signs of erosion. Years of moisture and temperature changes had weakened the stone. "What if we didn't try to break the chains?" she asked. "What if we broke the wall?" That night, May lay awake planning. In the horse barn, hanging on a peg behind old harnesses and forgotten tack, was a set of keys that the previous ranch foreman had left behind when he died of pneumonia the winter before. Cartwright had never bothered to sort through them, and May had seen keys among them that looked similar to the padlocks on Calder's chains. The next morning, she waited until Cartwright and his men rode out to check the cattle in the far pasture, a task that would keep them occupied for most of the day, with her heart hammering against her ribs. She slipped into the barn. The keys were exactly where she remembered, tarnished with age but still functional. She selected 3 that looked promising and tucked them deep in her apron pocket. Then, from a pile of discarded tools, she took a small hammer and a metal chisel that had been used for shoeing horses. The climb to the cave had never felt so fraught with danger. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound made her freeze with terror. If Cartwright returned early and found her gone, if he discovered what she had taken, the punishment would be severe beyond anything she had yet endured. Calder heard her coming long before she appeared at the cave mouth. After weeks of visits, he had memorized the rhythm of her footsteps, the particular way she navigated the treacherous path. But today something was different. Her breathing was labored, not from exertion, but from fear. "May," he called softly as she entered the cave. "What's wrong?" She moved quickly to his side, pulling the keys from her pocket with hands that shook visibly. "I found these in the barn. I thought, maybe—" Hope flared in his chest. Dangerous and bright, he had lived without hope for so long that its sudden return was almost painful. "Let me see them." The first key didn't fit any of the locks. Neither did the second. But when May inserted the third key into the padlock securing his left wrist, they both heard the telltale click of tumblers falling into place. The lock opened with a scrape of protesting metal. For a moment, neither of them moved. Calder stared at his freed wrist as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then, slowly, he flexed his fingers, rotated his wrist, marveled at the simple freedom of movement he had been denied for a decade. "My God," he whispered. It actually worked. The same key opened the lock on his right wrist, and suddenly his hands were free. May watched as he brought them together, palm to palm, for the first time in 10 years. Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks, and she felt her own eyes burning in sympathy. But the ankle chains proved more stubborn. None of the keys fit the locks, and the metal was thicker, more resistant to their efforts. They worked together, May holding the chain steady while Calder used the hammer and chisel to attack the weakened stone around the iron ring. The work was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. The sound of metal striking stone echoed through the cave with each blow, and May flinched every time, certain that someone would hear and come investigating. But Calder worked with the desperate strength of a man who could taste freedom after a decade of captivity. "Wait," May said suddenly, grabbing his wrist. "Do you hear that?" They both froze, listening. From outside came the distant sound of voices, men's voices, getting closer. "Hunters, maybe," Calder said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than she did. May's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She recognized one of those voices. Silas Cartwright had returned early from his cattle check, and he was climbing toward the cave with at least 2 other men. "You have to go," Calder said urgently. "Right now, before they find you here." "I can't leave you chained. May—" He gripped her shoulders with his newly freed hands. "If they find you here with me, they'll kill us both." At least this way. You have a chance. She looked at the partially freed chain around his ankle, at the progress they had made, at 10 years of suffering that might continue indefinitely if she left now. Then she looked at his face, not pleading for himself, but terrified for her. "I'll come back," she whispered. "I swear to you, I'll come back and finish this." "I know you will," he said, and the absolute faith in his voice nearly broke her heart. She grabbed her tools and fled toward the back of the cave, where she had discovered a narrow passage that led to another opening farther down the mountain. It was a tight squeeze, barely wide enough for her slight frame, but it would get her away from the cave without being seen. As she crawled through the cramped passage, she heard Cartwright's voice echoing from the main cave, closer now and filled with cruel amusement. Well, what have we here? Looks like our mountain man has been getting visitors." May's heart stopped. Somehow, he knew. Whether he had seen evidence of her visits or simply guessed, Cartwright knew she had been here. She emerged from the hidden passage into gray daylight and ran down the mountain as if devils were chasing her. Behind her, she could hear voices raised in anger, the sound of blows, and worst of all, Calder's grunt of pain as Cartwright and his men expressed their displeasure at finding the wrist chains unlocked. By the time she reached the ranch, May had managed to return the tools to their proper places and compose herself enough to appear busy with her normal duties. When Cartwright arrived an hour later, his face was flushed with exertion and barely contained rage. "Girl," he called sharply, "come here." May approached with the careful, submissive posture she had perfected over 3 years of servitude. "Yes, sir?" His small, pig-like eyes studied her face intently. "Been busy today. Have you?" "Yes, sir. I cleaned the kitchen and started preparations for dinner. Didn't wander off anywhere, didn't go exploring in the mountains." May's mouth went dry, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, sir, I've been here all day." For a long moment, he continued to stare at her. Then, without warning, his hand cracked across her face with enough force to send her stumbling backwards. "Don't lie to me," he snarled. "I found fresh footprints in that cave, small footprints, woman-sized footprints." May's cheek blazed with pain, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I don't know what you mean, sir." This time, his blow knocked her to the ground. She tasted blood from her split lip and felt the familiar shame of helplessness wash over her. "I know you've been up there," Cartwright continued, standing over her prone form. "Question is, why? What's that chained animal got that you'd risk your neck to bring it?" May said nothing, which only increased his fury. He kicked her in the ribs, and she curled into a ball, protecting her vital organs as she had learned to do. "Maybe you fancy yourself in love with a killer," he sneered. "Maybe you think that monster up there cares about a worthless piece of property like you." Still, May remained silent. Every word of denial would only convince him further of her guilt. "Well, let me tell you something, girl. That mountain man is going to die up there, slow and painful-like, and if I catch you within a mile of that cave again, you'll die right alongside him. You understand me?" May nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Now get up and fix my dinner. And if you're thinking of running off to warn your lover boy, remember that I've got men watching every path up that mountain. Try to help him again, and it'll be the last thing you ever do." That night, May lay on her thin mattress with fresh bruises blooming across her ribs and face. But physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish of knowing that Calder was trapped, probably hurt, and completely cut off from any hope of rescue. Cartwright's men would be watching the mountain paths, making any return visit impossible. Yet, even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, May felt something else stirring in her chest, a fierce, burning determination that surprised her with its intensity. For 10 years, Calder had survived in that cave through sheer stubborn will. He had endured cold, hunger, isolation, and the slow erosion of hope. Yet he had remained fundamentally human, fundamentally decent. She had found him, helped him, begun the process of setting him free. She had given him back his name, his dignity, his hope. and she'd be damned if she was going to let Silas Cartwright's cruelty undo all of that progress. Cartwright thought he had won by threatening her life. He thought fear would keep her away from the mountain, keep her obedient and compliant. But he had underestimated something crucial. May was no longer the broken, hopeless girl who had been sold 3 years ago. Caring for Calder, earning his respect and friendship, had reminded her that she was more than just property. She was a person with her own will, her own courage, her own capacity for love. And she was going to find a way to save them both. As the wind howled around the ranch house and snow began to fall, May closed her eyes and began to plan. Somewhere in the mountains above. Calder was planning too. She was certain of it. They would find each other again. They would finish what they had started. And when they did, nothing would ever chain either of them again. The blizzard that struck 3 days later was unlike anything the territory had seen in years. Snow fell in thick, blinding curtains, driven by winds that could knock a grown man off his feet. The temperature plummeted so low that water froze solid within minutes of being exposed to the air. Even Cartwright's hardened ranch hands spoke in hushed, worried tones about the storm's ferocity. For May, the blizzard was providence. On the second day of the storm, when visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, she made her move. Cartwright's men had abandoned their watch posts on the mountain paths, taking shelter in the bunkhouse where they huddled around a roaring fire and passed bottles of whiskey to ward off the cold. Cartwright himself had barricaded himself in his study, too drunk and too comfortable to venture outside. May wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she could find. 3 shawls, 2 pairs of stockings, boots lined with rags, and mittens she had knitted from scraps of wool. She filled a pack with food, blankets, and most importantly, the hammer and chisel she had hidden after her last visit to the cave. The climb up the mountain in the blizzard was the most terrifying thing she had ever attempted. The familiar path was completely obscured by snow, and she had to feel her way along by memory, testing each step to ensure she wasn't walking off a cliff into the howling white void. The wind cut through her layers of clothing like knives, and ice formed on her eyelashes, making it difficult to see even the few feet of visibility the storm allowed. More than once, she lost the path entirely and had to backtrack, feeling along rock faces with numb fingers until she found a landmark she recognized. The journey that usually took 40 minutes stretched into 3 hours of desperate struggle against the elements. When she finally stumbled into the cave mouth, she was so exhausted and frozen that she collapsed just inside the entrance. For several minutes, she lay there gasping, her lungs burning from the cold air, her body shaking uncontrollably. "May?" Calder's voice seemed to come from very far away. She forced herself to look up and saw him straining against his remaining chain, trying to reach her despite the iron ring that still held his ankle fast to the cave wall. "Jesus, woman, what were you thinking? You could have died out there." She managed a weak smile. Had to come back. Promised I would." With effort, she pulled herself to her feet and made her way to where he sat. In the dim light, she could see the evidence of Cartwright's visit. Fresh bruises on his face, dried blood on his knuckles where he had fought back against his captors. But his eyes were bright with joy at seeing her alive. "I thought you were dead," he said quietly. "When they found evidence of your visits, I thought Cartwright would kill you. He tried to scare me away." May began unwrapping the tools from her pack. "But I'm harder to scare than he thinks." They worked together on the weakened stone around the iron ring, taking turns with the hammer and chisel. The work warmed May's frozen limbs, and gradually feeling returned to her fingers. Calder's hands, she noticed, were steadier now that they were free from the wrist shackles, and he was able to strike with more precision. "Tell me about the cabin," May said during one of their rest periods. "The one you mentioned before, where we'll go when you're free." Calder paused in his work, a distant look entering his eyes. "Built it myself, about 15 miles from here, deeper in the mountains where most folks don't go. It's rough, nothing fancy, but it's got a good fireplace, solid walls, a roof that don't leak much." "Is it still standing?" "Should be. built it to last, and it's in a sheltered spot. He resumed chipping away at the stone. There's a creek nearby with good water, deer trails for hunting, and enough timber to keep a fire going through the worst winters. May imagined it, a place where they could be safe, where no one owned either of them, where they could simply exist as human beings. The vision gave strength to her aching arms as she took her turn with the chisel. It was nearly midnight when the iron ring finally came loose from the wall. The moment it clattered to the cave floor, Calder sat perfectly still, as if he couldn't quite believe that the sound he had dreamed of hearing for 10 years had actually occurred. Then he stood up, for the first time in a decade. Calder Boone rose to his full height, unrestrained. He was taller than May had realized, broad-shouldered and imposing despite the years of captivity. The chain still hung from his ankle, but he was mobile, free to move beyond the confines of his stone prison. He took a tentative step forward, then another. His legs, weakened by years of limited movement, shook slightly, but they held his weight. May watched as tears streamed down his weathered face. "I never thought," he began, then stopped, overwhelmed by emotion. May stood and walked to him. Without hesitation, she took his hands in hers, those large, scarred hands that had known both violence and gentleness. "You're free, Calder. You're finally free." He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. In the dim cave light, his pale eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. "We both are," he said softly. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, giving them time to plan their escape and for Calder to regain some of his strength. May had brought enough food to sustain them both, and they used the enforced delay to prepare for the journey to his hidden cabin. During those long hours, they talked more intimately than ever before. May told him about her childhood before the tragedy that had made her an orphan, about her dreams of having a family, a home, a life of her own choosing. Calder spoke of his plans for the future, how he wanted to clear more land, maybe raise cattle again, build a life far from the corruption and cruelty they had both known. On the second night, as the storm still howled outside, they sat close together for warmth, sharing May's blankets. The proximity was both innocent and charged with unspoken possibilities. May had never been this close to a man who treated her with respect, who saw her as more than property or an object to be used. "May," Calder said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. She turned to look at him and found his face very close to hers. In the flickering light from their small fire, she could see every line etched by suffering, every scar left by his ordeal. But she could also see something else, a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. "I need you to know something," he continued. "These past weeks, getting to know you, having someone care whether I lived or died, it's given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope. Not just hope of getting free, but hope that there might be something worth living for after freedom." His hand came up to gently touch her cheek. "You saved my life in more ways than one." May felt tears prick at her eyes. "You saved mine too. Before I found you, I was just existing, surviving from one day to the next. You reminded me that I'm a person, not just property." They moved closer together, drawn by a force that had been building between them for weeks. When Calder's lips finally met hers, the kiss was gentle, hesitant, as if he were afraid she might pull away. But May leaned into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, her heart racing with a mixture of desire and deep, abiding affection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I don't want to take advantage," Calder said, his voice strained. "You've been hurt, used by men who saw you as less than human. I won't be another man who takes what he wants without thought for what you want." May felt her heart swell with love for this man who, even in the grip of desire, put her well-being before his own needs. "What I want," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "is you, not because I owe you anything or because I'm grateful, but because somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." The confession hung in the air between them. Calder searched her face as if looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. Finding none, He pulled her close again, this time with less restraint. "I love you too, May," he whispered against her hair. "More than I ever thought I could love anyone." What followed was a joining that was both passionate and tender, desperate and reverent. They came together with the hunger of two people who had been starved not just for physical intimacy, but for human connection, for the simple miracle of being truly known and accepted by another soul. Later, as they lay entwined under the shared blankets, listening to the storm begin to abate outside, May felt a peace she had never known. In Calder's arms, she was not a slave or property or a burden to be endured. She was simply May, loved, valued, cherished. "When this storm clears," Calder said quietly, "we'll have to move fast. Cartwright will come looking for me eventually, and when he does, he'll bring enough men to cause real trouble." May nodded against his chest. "How far is it to your cabin?" "In good weather, maybe 6 hours on foot. With snow this deep and my legs still weak." He paused, calculating. "Maybe 10 hours, with the rest stops." "Can we make it?" "We'll make it," he said with quiet certainty. "I've got something worth fighting for now." The storm finally broke on the third day, revealing a world transformed by snow. The familiar landscape was buried under drifts that reached nearly to May's waist in places, but the sun shone brilliantly in a clear blue sky, and the wind had died to a gentle whisper. They prepared to leave as the sun reached its zenith, giving them maximum daylight for their journey. May had fashioned a rough pack from one of the blankets, filled with what food remained and the few possessions either of them owned. Calder had found a sturdy branch that would serve as a walking stick, helping him navigate the deep snow and support his still weakening legs. Before they left the cave that had been both prison and sanctuary, Calder turned back for one final look. May watched his face as he gazed at the chains that had held him for so long, now lying broken and useless on the stone floor. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. He shook his head, then took her hand in his. "Only that it took 10 years to find you." Together, they stepped out of the cave and into the brilliant white world beyond. Behind them lay everything that had sought to break them: cruelty, captivity, despair. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. They were free, they were together, and they were in love. For the first time in either of their lives. That felt like enough. The cabin was everything Calder had promised and more. Nestled in a grove of towering pines, protected from the worst winds by a natural depression in the mountainside, it stood solid and weatherproof despite a decade of abandonment. The walls were built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss, and the roof, though covered with pine needles and snow, showed no signs of serious damage. May stood in the doorway, watching as Calder moved through the single room with wonder in his eyes. He touched familiar objects as if greeting old friends: the rough-hewn table he had built with his own hands, the stone fireplace that dominated one wall, the narrow bed frame in the corner that would need new rope and a mattress. "It's perfect," May said softly, and meant it. After years of sleeping on a thin straw mattress behind Cartwright's kitchen, this simple cabin felt like a palace. They spent their first week making the place livable again. Calder's strength returned gradually as he worked to repair the damage time had inflicted on his sanctuary. May proved surprisingly handy with domestic tasks that went beyond mere survival. She could weave rope from plant fibers, patch holes with mud and grass, and turn the simplest ingredients into nourishing meals. The forest provided everything they needed. Calder taught May to set snares for rabbits and track deer through the snow. His aim with the old rifle he had hidden in the cabin was still true. Despite years of enforced inactivity, May learned to skin and dress game, to smoke meat for preservation, to identify edible plants that grew even in winter. More importantly, they learned each other. May discovered that Calder had a dry sense of humor that emerged more frequently as his natural personality reasserted itself. He was patient when teaching her new skills, gentle when her inexperience led to mistakes, and passionate when they came together in the narrow bed they now shared. Calder marveled at May's resilience and intelligence. She learned quickly, adapted to their primitive lifestyle without complaint. and brought a warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. In the evenings, she would sit beside him and talk about books she had read, songs her mother had taught her, dreams she had harbored even during the darkest days of her captivity. For 6 blissful weeks, they lived as if the outside world didn't exist. They were Adam and Eve in their own private Eden, free from the judgment and cruelty of civilization. May began to believe they might actually build a life here, hidden away from all those who would see them as less than human. But Eden, as May remembered from her childhood Bible lessons, was never meant to last forever. The first sign of trouble came on a clear morning in early March. Calder had gone out to check his trap lines while May tended the fire and prepared their breakfast. She was humming softly to herself, content in the domestic routine they had established, when she heard voices echoing through the trees. Male voices, multiple men, talking in the loud, careless way of people who weren't worried about being overheard. May's blood turned to ice. She quickly banked the fire to reduce the smoke and crept to the single window, peering through a gap in the shutters Calder had closed against the morning chill. Through the trees, she could see them, 4 men on horseback, moving slowly through the forest. They were dressed like hunters, with the rifles slung across their saddles and the kind of heavy winter clothing that suggested they were prepared for an extended stay in the mountains. But May recognized the way they rode, the purposeful way they scanned the forest around them. These weren't hunters looking for game. These were hunters looking for people. One of them was pointing toward the cabin, saying something to his companions that May couldn't quite make out, but she didn't need to hear the words to understand their meaning. Somehow, someone had figured out where Calder might have gone. She waited until they disappeared deeper into the forest, then grabbed her shawl and ran to find Calder. She found him a quarter-mile from the cabin, skinning a rabbit he had caught in one of his snares. He looked up at her approach, his face immediately clouding with concern at her obvious distress. "Men!" she gasped, still out of breath from her run through the snow. 4 of them, on horseback. They were looking at the cabin. Calder's face went grim. He quickly finished with the rabbit and gathered his traps. "Bounty hunters, most likely. Word must have gotten out that I escaped." "What do we do?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking rapidly. "We can't stay here, even if they don't find the cabin today. They'll keep looking. And where there are 4, there'll be more." May felt tears prick at her eyes. She had known this day would come eventually, but she had hoped for more time. Time to prepare, time to plan, time to simply be happy in their hidden sanctuary. "Where can we go?" she asked. "There's a town about 30 miles west of here, Redemption. It's rough, but the sheriff there is a decent man. If I can get to him, tell my story, maybe he'll listen." May stared at him in disbelief. "You want to turn yourself in?" "I want to clear my name," Calder said firmly. "I'm tired of running. May, tired of hiding. I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, and I won't ask you to live that way either. But if they don't believe you, then at least I'll have tried." He took her hands in his eyes intense. "I've been a dead man for 10 years. These past weeks with you, I've remembered what it feels like to be alive. I'd rather die fighting for the truth than live the rest of my days as a hunted animal." May understood his reasoning, but that didn't make it easier to accept. The thought of losing him now, just when they had found happiness together, was almost unbearable. "There's something else," Calder continued quietly. "If I stay here, if we keep hiding, eventually they'll find us. And when they do, they'll take you too. Harboring a fugitive, aiding an escape, they'll make you pay for helping me." The truth of his words settled over May like a cold blanket. She had been so focused on their present happiness that she hadn't fully considered the long-term consequences of their situation. They returned to the cabin to pack what few possessions they could carry. May filled her makeshift pack with food and warm clothes, while Calder gathered his rifle, ammunition, and a small pouch of gold coins he had hidden beneath a loose floorboard, all that remained of his former life. As they prepared to leave the only home they had ever shared, May felt grief well up in her chest. This cabin had been their sanctuary, the place where they had discovered love and learned to trust again. Walking away felt like abandoning a piece of themselves. "We'll come back," Calder said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "When this is all over, when my name is clear, we'll come back here." May nodded, not trusting her voice. She wanted to believe him, but she had learned not to count on happy endings. They left the cabin as the sun was setting, traveling by night to avoid the bounty hunters who were surely still combing the forest. The journey to redemption would take them through treacherous mountain passes and across territory controlled by hostile tribes. But it was their only chance. For the first 2 nights, they made good progress. Calder's knowledge of the mountain trails served them well, and they managed to stay ahead of any pursuit. They slept during the day in hidden caves or dense thickets, and traveled by moonlight when the terrain allowed. But on the 3rd night, their luck ran out. They were crossing a narrow valley, following a frozen stream bed, when May heard the distinctive whinny of a horse somewhere behind them. Calder heard it too and immediately pushed her toward a cluster of boulders near the stream bank. "Hide," he whispered urgently. "No matter what happens, don't come out until you're sure they're gone. I won't leave you. May—" His voice was firm but gentle. "I need to know you're safe. It's the only way I can do what needs to be done." She wanted to argue, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut off any protest. With tears streaming down her face, she squeezed into a crevice between the rocks just as 4 riders emerged from the tree line. "Well, well," called a voice she didn't recognize. "If it isn't the famous mountain man himself. Calder Boone, wanted for murder and God knows what else." May could see Calder through a gap in the rocks. He stood in the middle of the stream bed, his rifle in his hands but not raised in a threatening manner. He looked calm, resigned, like a man who had made peace with his fate. "I surrender," he called back. "But I want to talk to Sheriff Morrison in Redemption. I've got a story to tell, and witnesses who can back it up." The lead rider, a thin man with a scraggly beard, laughed harshly. "Only place you're going is back to face justice for what you done. There's a rope waiting for you. Boone, I didn't kill anyone," Calder said firmly. "I was framed by my half-brother and his friends. There are people who can testify to that." "Sure there are," another rider scoffed. "Just like there are people who can testify you've been living up here like some kind of wild animal, probably killing anyone who wandered too close." May could see that reasoning with these men was futile. They had already decided Calder's guilt, and nothing he said would change their minds. They were here for the bounty, not for justice. What happened next unfolded with terrible swiftness. One of the bounty hunters, perhaps growing impatient with the conversation, raised his rifle and fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the rocks near Calder's feet. "That's enough talking," the man called. "Drop the rifle and put your hands up, or the next shot goes through your heart." Calder looked at the 4 men surrounding him, then at the rifle in his hands. May could see the calculation in his eyes, the odds, the distances, the chances of survival. Then his gaze swept briefly over the rocks where she was hidden, and she saw his decision crystallize. Slowly, he set the rifle down on the frozen ground and raised his hands. The bounty hunters moved in quickly, binding his hands behind his back with a rough efficiency. May watched in anguish as they threw him across one of their horses like a sack of grain, showing no concern for his comfort or dignity. "Please," Calder called out as they prepared to ride away. "At least take me to Sheriff Morrison. Let me tell my side of the story. Your story don't matter to nobody." The leader replied, "Dead or alive, the bounty's the same. You just made sure we collect it the easy way." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, May emerged from her hiding place and collapsed in the snow. For the 2nd time in her life, she had lost everything that mattered to her. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't going to accept defeat quietly. Calder had been willing to surrender himself to protect her, to give her a chance at freedom. Now it was her turn to fight for him. May picked up Calder's discarded rifle and checked the remaining ammunition. Then she turned toward the distant lights of Redemption and began to walk. She had 30 miles to cover and very little time before the bounty hunters delivered Calder to whatever rough justice awaited him. But she would cover those miles. And when she reached redemption, she would find people willing to listen to the truth. Calder had mentioned witnesses, Seth the cook, maybe others who remembered the man he had been before his imprisonment. She had saved him once from chains and darkness. Now she would save him from the noose. The woman who had once been a nameless slave was about to discover just how strong love could make her. May reached the outskirts of redemption as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern mountains. The town was larger than she had expected, a rough collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that was ankle-deep in mud and horse manure. Even at this early hour, the place hummed with activity as miners, ranchers, and merchants began their daily routines. She had pushed herself mercilessly through the night, stopping only when exhaustion threatened to drop her in her tracks. Her feet were blistered inside her worn boots. Her lungs burned from the thin mountain air. But the thought of Calder facing execution had driven her forward when her body wanted to collapse. The jail was easy enough to find. A squat stone building near the center of town with iron bars visible through its single window. May's heart clenched as she saw him there, sitting on a narrow cot with his head in his hands. Even from the street, she could see the defeat in his posture, but there was no time for grief. According to conversations she had overheard from late-night travelers on the road, the bounty hunters had wasted no time in demanding their payment. Word was that Calder Boone would hang at noon, barely 6 hours from now. May straightened her shoulders and walked toward the largest building on the street, a 2-story structure with Morrison's General Store and Telegraph Office painted across its front in fading letters. If Sheriff Morrison was indeed the decent man Calder believed him to be, she would find him here. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from behind the counter. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years working outdoors before settling into shopkeeping. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone born further south. "Are you Sheriff Morrison?" May asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "I am. Though I run this store too. Sheriff don't pay enough to live on in a town this size." His eyes took in her travel-stained clothes, her obvious exhaustion. "You look like you've had a hard night. What can I do for you?" "It's about the man they brought in yesterday, Calder Boone." Morrison's expression grew cautious. "What about him?" "He's innocent," May said simply. "The murder he's accused of, he didn't do it. He was framed by his half-brother and some others who wanted his land." The sheriff studied her for a long moment. "That's a serious accusation. Miss, you got any proof of what you're saying?" May took a deep breath and told him everything. About finding Calder chained in the cave, about learning his story, about the witnesses who could testify to his character. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful as she spoke. "You said Seth Williams vouched for him?" Morrison asked when she finished. "Old Seth, who used to cook for various outfits around here. You know him?" "Known Seth for 15 years. He's got his faults, drinks too much, talks even more, but he's never been a liar." Morrison leaned back against his counter. "And he did used to tell stories about Calder Boone, said he was the finest man he ever rode with." Hope flickered in May's chest. "Then you believe me?" "I believe you believe what you're telling me," Morrison said carefully. "But believing it myself is a different matter. Those bounty hunters brought me wanted posters, official documents. Far as the law is concerned, Calder Boone is guilty of murder." "But you haven't executed him yet," May pointed out. "Why not?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Because something about this whole business has been bothering me since they brought him in. Man they described as a vicious killer sat in that cell all night without causing a bit of trouble. Asked polite for water, said thank you when my deputy brought him food. Don't act like any murderer I ever dealt with. Then give him a chance," May pleaded. "Let him tell his story. Talk to the witnesses." "What witnesses? You keep mentioning people who can vouch for him, but where are they?" May's heart sank. She hadn't thought this far ahead. Seth was still at Cartwright's ranch, probably unaware that Calder had even escaped. The other people Calder had mentioned, the preacher, the veteran, she didn't even know their names or where to find them. I don't know exactly where they are, she admitted. But they exist. If we could just delay the execution, send word around the territory. Miss, Morrison interrupted gently. I understand you care about this man, but I can't delay a legal execution based on the word of... He paused, seeming to struggle with how to phrase something delicately. Based on the word of what? May asked, though she already knew what he was thinking. A woman who's been living in the wilderness with a wanted fugitive, he said finally. Folks around here are going to wonder about your judgment, your reputation. May felt heat rise in her cheeks. Even here, even when trying to save the man she loved, she was being judged for circumstances beyond her control. My reputation doesn't matter, she said firmly. What matters is that an innocent man is going to die if someone doesn't speak up for him. Morrison studied her face for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Tell you what, it's still early. I'll ride out to a few of the nearby ranches. See if I can find this Seth Williams you mentioned. If he backs up your story, I'll consider postponing the execution until we can investigate further. Thank you, May breathed. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Morrison warned. I'm making no promises, and if I can't find anyone willing to vouch for Boone's character, that rope is still waiting for him at noon. The sheriff left May in his store while he rode out to make inquiries. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. May paced the narrow aisles, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. If Morrison couldn't find Seth, if no one was willing to speak for Calder, what then? Could she break him out of jail? Could they escape together into the wilderness? But even as she considered desperate measures, May knew they would only make things worse. Running would only confirm Calder's guilt in everyone's eyes. Their only hope lay in proving his innocence, not in fleeing from justice. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Morrison returned, and May's heart sank when she saw his expression. He looked frustrated, disappointed, like a man who had hoped for better news than he was about to deliver. I found Seth, he said without preamble. He's working for Cartwright now, and he confirmed everything you told me about Boone's character. Says he'd trust him with his life. May felt a surge of hope. Then you'll postpone the execution? Morrison held up a hand. I also talked to some other folks who remember the old days. A preacher named Father Mackenzie who runs a mission about 20 miles east of here, and a veteran named Jacob Hardy who used to range cattle with Boone before he went up into the mountains. And they both said the same thing Seth did, far as they knew. Calder Boone was an honest man who wouldn't hurt anybody unless they were threatening innocent folks. May could barely contain her excitement. So you'll let him go? I'm willing to postpone the hanging, Morrison said slowly. Give us time to send telegrams, investigate the original charges, maybe get some official word from the territorial government about whether this case was handled proper. Relief flooded through May's body like warm honey. How long will that take? Maybe a week. Maybe more. Depends on how cooperative the authorities are back where the original crime took place. Morrison's expression grew stern. But I want to be clear about something. Miss, I'm doing this based on the word of 3 men I trust, not because I'm convinced of Boone's innocence. If the investigation confirms his guilt, he hangs. You understand that? May nodded quickly. A week was more time than she had dared hope for. Surely in a week, they could uncover the truth about Thomas Boone's lies and Sarah's betrayal. Can I see him? She asked. Can I tell him what's happening? Morrison considered this. I suppose that would be all right, but just for a few minutes, and my deputy will be watching. The jail cell was even smaller than it had appeared from outside. Calder looked up as May approached, his eyes widening with surprise and concern. May, what are you doing here? I told you to stay hidden. I couldn't let them hang you, she said simply. I found witnesses, people who vouched for your character. Sheriff Morrison is postponing the execution while he investigates. The hope that flickered in Calder's eyes was painful to witness. After so many years of disappointment, he was afraid to believe that justice might finally be possible. "Who did you find?" he asked quietly. "Seth Williams, Father Mackenzie, and Jacob Hardy. They all remembered you." "Calder. They all said you were a good man." Calder's hands gripped the iron bars of his cell. "Jacob still alive? I wondered what happened to him after I disappeared." "He's alive, and he wants to help. They all do." May reached through the bars to touch his face. "We're going to prove your innocence. Calder, we're going to get you free. Legally this time. And if we can't," May met his gaze steadily, "then we'll face whatever comes together. I'm not leaving you again." That afternoon, May found herself standing in the middle of Redemption's main street, surrounded by a growing crowd of curious townspeople. Word had spread quickly about the postponed execution, and opinions were divided about whether Sheriff Morrison had made the right decision. Some folks grumbled that justice delayed was justice denied, that Calder Boone was a convicted killer who deserved whatever punishment was coming to him. But others, perhaps swayed by the testimony of respected men like Father Mackenzie and Jacob Hardy, seemed willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. It was then that May made a decision that would surprise even herself. Standing there in the dusty street, facing a crowd that viewed her with everything from curiosity to suspicion, she raised her voice and began to speak. "My name is May," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Some of you probably wonder who I am, what right I have to interfere in this business. Well, I'll tell you who I am." The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something important was about to be said. "I'm a woman who was sold into bondage by a man who claimed to be family. I'm a woman who lived as property for 3 years, beaten and degraded by a man who thought he owned me. I'm a woman who had given up hope of ever being treated as human again." May could see shock and sympathy flickering across some faces, skepticism and discomfort on others, but she pressed on. "And then I found Calder Boone, chained in a cave like an animal, abandoned to die by people who wanted to steal what was rightfully his. For 10 years, that man suffered in darkness and cold, innocent of any crime except trusting the wrong people." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "But do you know what he did when a frightened, broken woman brought him scraps of food? He treated her with kindness. He spoke to her like she was a person worthy of respect. He gave her hope when she had none." May looked around the crowd, meeting eyes, challenging the townspeople to really see her. "Calder Boone didn't just save my body from bondage. He saved my soul from despair. If that's the kind of man you think capable of cold-blooded murder, then you don't know what goodness looks like." The silence that followed her words was profound. May could see people looking at each other, whispering, reconsidering their assumptions. She had spoken not as a desperate woman pleading for her lover's life, but as a witness testifying to the truth of her own experience. Father Mackenzie, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. "I've known Calder Boone for 15 years, he said in his clear, carrying voice. "And everything this young woman just said matches the man I remember. If she says he's innocent, I believe her." "So do I," said Jacob Hardy, pushing through the crowd to stand beside the priest. "I rode with Calder when we were both young men. He risked his own life more than once to protect folks who couldn't protect themselves. Whatever happened to him these past years, it wasn't justice." One by one, other voices began to join in. People who remembered small kindnesses, acts of courage, moments when Calder Boone had chosen to help rather than harm. The mood of the crowd was shifting, and May could feel it like a change in the weather. When Sheriff Morrison appeared on the steps of his office, the entire town seemed to turn toward him with expectation. "I've sent telegrams to the territorial capital and to the county where the original crime took place," he announced. "We should have answers within the week. Until then, Calder Boone remains in my custody, and I'll thank everyone to let the law take its course." As the crowd began to disperse, May felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Father Mackenzie smiling at her with warmth and approval. "That was bravely done, my dear," he said quietly. "Sometimes the truth needs a voice, and you gave it one today." May looked back toward the jail where Calder waited, hope and fear warring in her heart. The next few days would determine whether love and truth were strong enough to overcome years of lies and injustice. But for the first time since this ordeal began, May believed they might actually have a chance. The telegram arrived on a Thursday morning, crackling over the wires from the territorial capital with news that would change everything. May was sweeping the front steps of Morrison's store, where she had been staying in a small room above the shop, when she heard the distinctive tap-tap-tap of the telegraph key from the office next door. Sheriff Morrison emerged 20 minutes later, his face grave but his eyes holding something that looked cautiously like hope. May dropped her broom and hurried to meet him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What does it say?" she asked breathlessly. Morrison held up the yellow paper. "Says Thomas Boone confessed on his deathbed 2 months ago. Admitted to framing Calder for the preacher's murder. Said his conscience couldn't let him die with that sin on his soul." May felt her knees go weak with relief. He confessed? More than that. Apparently he'd been carrying around a letter from Sarah, Calder's former fiancée, admitting her part in the deception. The territorial governor has issued a full pardon based on the confession and ordered all charges dropped immediately. For a moment, May couldn't speak. After 10 years of suffering, after weeks of desperate hope and crushing fear, it was finally over. Calder was free, truly, legally free. "Can I tell him?" she whispered. Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since this whole ordeal began. "I think that honor should be yours." May ran to the jail, her skirts flying, not caring who saw her undignified haste. She burst through the door to find Calder sitting on his narrow cot, staring out the barred window at the mountains beyond. He looked up at the sound of her entrance, and she saw her own desperate hope reflected in his pale eyes. "Thomas confessed," she gasped, still out of breath from her run. "On his deathbed, he admitted everything, framing you, bribing Sarah, stealing your land. You're free. Calder, you're completely free." The silence that followed was so profound that May could hear her own heartbeat. Calder stared at her as if he hadn't quite heard correctly, as if the words were in a language he didn't understand. "Free?" he repeated quietly. "The territorial governor issued a full pardon. All charges dropped. Sheriff Morrison is getting the keys right now." Calder stood slowly, his legs unsteady, and May realized he was trembling. 10 years of imprisonment, weeks of facing execution, and now sudden reprieve. It was almost too much for any human mind to process. When Morrison arrived with the keys, Calder watched in silent amazement as the cell door swung open. He stepped across the threshold hesitantly, as if afraid the freedom might be snatched away at any moment. "What happens now?" May asked Morrison. "Now, mister, Boone is free to go wherever he pleases," the sheriff replied, "though I'd recommend staying in town for a few days while we get all the paperwork sorted out. There might be some compensation owed to you, Calder, for the years you lost." But Calder shook his head. "Don't want compensation, just want to be left alone to live my life." "And what kind of life is that going to be?" Morrison asked gently. Calder looked at May, and she saw the question in his eyes. Everything had happened so fast. They hadn't had time to discuss what freedom might actually mean for them as a couple. "We need to talk," May said quietly. "Figure out what comes next." That evening, they walked together along the creek that ran behind the town, finally alone after days of public scrutiny and legal proceedings. The spring air was warm, filled with the scent of wildflowers and new grass, and May thought she had never experienced anything more beautiful than this simple freedom to walk beside the man she loved without fear or hiding. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Calder said as they settled on a fallen log beside the water. "That this is all some dream, and I'll open my eyes to find myself back in that cave." May took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "It's real. You're free, and we're together, and no one can separate us again." "About that," Calder said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "May, you've sacrificed so much for me. Your safety, your reputation, maybe your whole future. Now that I'm free, you don't have to—" "Don't!" May interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare suggest that I only helped you out of pity or obligation. That's not what I meant. I want you to know that you have choices now. You could stay in town, find work, build a respectable life. You don't have to tie yourself to an ex-convict with nothing to his name." May turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing with determination. "Calder Boone, do you love me?" "More than my own life," he replied without hesitation. "And I love you. Not because you needed saving, not because I felt sorry for you, but because you're the best man I've ever known. You're kind and strong and decent, and you see me as something more than property or a burden to be endured. May, I don't want a respectable life in town," she continued. "I want a life with you. Wherever that takes us, I want to go back to that cabin in the mountains, build something real together, away from people who judge us for our past instead of who we are now." Relief flooded Calder's features. "Are you sure? It won't be easy. We'll have to start over with nothing." "We won't have nothing," May said, squeezing his hand. "We'll have each other. We'll have love. That's more than most people ever get." They stayed by the creek until the stars appeared overhead, making plans and sharing dreams they had been afraid to voice during the dark days of uncertainty. They would return to the cabin, make it into a real home. Calder would hunt and trap, maybe raise some livestock if they could afford it. May would tend a garden, preserve food for winter, perhaps take in sewing or other work to earn extra money. "There's something else I want," Calder said as they prepared to head back to town. "What's that?" "I want to marry you, properly, with a preacher and witnesses and all the legal papers. I want the whole world to know that you're my wife, that you chose to be with me of your own free will." May felt tears of joy prick at her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that too." Father Mackenzie was delighted to perform the ceremony and insisted that it take place in the small chapel he had built behind the general store. "It's not much to look at," he admitted, "but it's been blessed by honest love and sincere prayer. Seems fitting for two people who found each other against such odds." The wedding was simple but perfect. May wore a dress that the Women of Redemption had hastily altered from one donated by the doctor's wife. Pale blue cotton with tiny pearl buttons and lace at the collar. Calder had traded some of his old gold coins for a new shirt and pants, and looked more handsome than May had ever seen him. Sheriff Morrison served as best man, while Jacob Hardy walked May down the aisle in the absence of any family. Seth Williams had ridden in from Cartwright's ranch for the occasion, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched the man he had thought dead for 10 years pledge his life to the woman who had saved him. "Do you, Calder Boone, take May to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Calder said, his voice strong and clear. "And do you, May, take Calder to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," May replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Then, by the power vested in me by God and the territorial government, I pronounce you husband and wife. Calder, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise for the future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, the small congregation erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward was modest but heartfelt. The townspeople had contributed food and drink, and someone had even produced a fiddle for dancing. May found herself swept into the arms of various well-wishers, spun around the makeshift dance floor until she was dizzy with laughter. But the moment she treasured most came when the sun was setting and the party was winding down. Calder found her sitting on the chapel steps, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. "Any regrets, Mrs. Boone?" he asked, settling beside her. May tested the name, rolling it around in her mind like a precious gem. Mrs. Boone, May Boone. For the first time in her adult life, she had a name that belonged to her by choice, not circumstance. "Not a single one," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "What about you? Only that it took us so long to find each other." They left Redemption the next morning, riding double on a sturdy horse that Sheriff Morrison had helped them purchase. Their few possessions were packed in saddlebags behind them, and May carried a bag of rice that the women of the town had pressed upon her as a wedding gift. As they climbed into the mountains, leaving civilization behind, May felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She was going home, not to a place where she was owned or tolerated, but to a place where she was loved and wanted. The cabin looked exactly as they had left it weeks earlier, but somehow it felt different now. This wasn't a hiding place anymore, or a temporary refuge from a hostile world. This was their home, the place where Mr. and Mrs. Boone would build their life together. That night, as they lay entwined in their narrow bed, listening to the wind sing through the pines, May thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment, from a nameless slave and a chained prisoner to husband and wife, free to love each other without fear or shame. "Thank you," Calder whispered against her hair. "For what? For seeing me as human when the rest of the world saw a monster? For risking everything to set me free? For choosing to build a life with me when you could have chosen safety instead?" May turned in his arms, pressing her palm against his heart. "You did the same for me," she said softly. "You saw me as a person worth saving when I'd forgotten that myself. We saved each other. Calder, that's what love does." Outside their window, the mountains stood silent and eternal under a canopy of stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the work of building a sustainable life, the inevitable hardships of frontier existence, the ongoing task of creating something beautiful from the ashes of their former suffering. But tonight, May Boone fell asleep in her husband's arms, completely free and completely loved for the first time in her life. It was enough. It was everything. 1 year later, the sound of hammering echoed through the mountain valley as Calder expanded their modest cabin. What had once been a single room now boasted a proper kitchen, a second bedroom, and a covered porch where May could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The changes to their home reflected the changes in their lives. May's belly, now round with their first child, made it difficult for her to help with the heavier construction work, but she contributed in countless other ways. Her vegetable garden had flourished beyond their wildest expectations, providing not only food for their table, but surplus to trade with the occasional travelers who passed through their remote valley. "Hand me that board, will you?" Calder called from his perch on the roof, where he was replacing shingles damaged by the previous winter's storms. May laughed, one hand supporting her back. "At 6 months with child, I think my board lifting days are behind me. Husband." Calder grinned and climbed down to retrieve the lumber himself. As he passed May, he paused to kiss her forehead and place a gentle hand on her swollen belly. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Boone?" "Like I'm carrying a future lumberjack," May replied, rubbing the spot where tiny feet had been kicking her ribs all morning. "This child of yours is already as restless as his father." Or her father, Calder corrected with a smile. Could be a daughter with her mother's determination. The thought of their child, son or daughter, filled both of them with wonder and not a little anxiety. Neither had experienced the kind of loving family they hoped to provide, but they were determined to learn together, to create something better than what either had known. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Calder immediately moved protectively closer to May, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that was never far from reach. Years of persecution had taught him to be cautious, even in their remote sanctuary. But as the riders came into view, May recognized the familiar figure of Sheriff Morrison, accompanied by 2 other men she didn't know. All 3 looked tired and travel-worn, as if they had been riding hard for days. "Morrison," Calder called out, stepping forward but keeping himself between the approaching men and his pregnant wife. "What brings you all the way out here?" The sheriff dismounted, his expression serious but not hostile. "Calder, May, sorry to disturb your peace, but we've got a situation that requires your help." May felt her stomach clench with anxiety. They had worked so hard to build this quiet life, free from the conflicts and complexities of the outside world. The thought of being drawn back into danger, especially with a baby on the way, terrified her. "What kind of situation?" Calder asked carefully. Morrison gestured to his companions. "This here is Marshal Stevens from the territorial capital and Deputy Clark from Copper Creek. They're tracking a group of men who've been terrorizing settlements throughout the region, robbing, burning, killing innocent folks." "What does that have to do with us?" May asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Marshal Stevens stepped forward, a thin man with intelligent eyes and prematurely gray hair. "We've been following their trail for weeks, but they keep disappearing into the mountains. We need someone who knows this country, someone who can track them to their hideout." "And you think that someone is me?" Calder said flatly. "You lived up here for years," Morrison pointed out. "You know every trail, every cave, every place a man could hide. Without your help, these killers are going to keep terrorizing innocent people." May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She could see the conflict playing out on Calder's face, his desire to protect their peaceful life, warring with his ingrained need to help those who couldn't help themselves. "I'm not a lawman," Calder said slowly. "I'm just trying to build a quiet life with my wife." "We're not asking you to join a posse." Deputy Clark spoke up for the first time. He was younger than the others, with the eager intensity of someone still proving himself. "Just guide us to where you think they might be hiding. Point us in the right direction." "And what about May?" Calder asked. "I won't leave her alone, not in her condition." May felt a sudden surge of memory. Another time when well-meaning men had asked Calder to help them. Another moment when doing the right thing had led to years of suffering. But she also remembered the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had spent years helping people who had no one else to turn to. "How many people have they killed?" she asked quietly. Marshal Stevens looked surprised by the question, but answered honestly. "At least 15 that we know of, ma'am, including children. They hit a farm family last week, killed the parents, burned the house with the little one still inside." May closed her eyes, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her as if sensing her distress. She thought of those children, innocent and helpless, and knew what she had to do. "Go," she said to Calder. "May, go help them," she repeated firmly. "Those people need you, and you'll never forgive yourself if you turn your back on them." "I can't leave you alone. You won't be." May smiled at his concern, even as her heart ached at the thought of separation. "Mrs. Henderson from Copper Creek has been wanting to visit. I'll send word for her to come stay with me until you get back." Calder stared at her for a long moment, love and admiration warring with worry in his expression. "Are you sure?" May took his hands in hers, feeling the familiar calluses and scars that told the story of his life. "I'm sure. Those people need the man I married, the one who can't stand to see innocents suffer. Just promise me you'll be careful, and that you'll come home to us." "I promise," he said, pulling her close and kissing her deeply, not caring that the lawmen were watching. The preparations took the rest of the day. May packed food and supplies while Calder checked his weapons and gear. As evening approached, she insisted on cooking a farewell dinner for everyone, turning their simple cabin into a place of warmth and hospitality. "You've got a remarkable woman, Boone," Marshal Stevens commented as May served him a second helping of venison stew. Not many wives would send their husbands off on a dangerous mission without complaint. "May's stronger than she looks," Calder replied, catching her eye across the table. "Stronger than most men I've known." That night, as they lay together in their bed for what might be the last time in weeks, May traced the contours of Calder's face with her fingertips, memorizing every detail. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "So am I," Calder replied, "but not of the killers we're tracking. I'm scared of leaving you and the baby, scared something might happen while I'm gone." May pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "We'll be fine. Mrs. Henderson knows about birthing babies, and Doctor. Winters in Copper Creek isn't that far away if there's trouble. And if I don't come back—" "You will," May interrupted fiercely. You survived 10 years in chains. Calder Boone, you're not going to let some common criminals separate us now. 3 days later, May stood on their porch watching until the group of riders disappeared into the forest. Mrs. Henderson had arrived the previous evening, a sturdy widow in her 50s who had raised 6 children of her own and delivered dozens of others. "Don't you worry, dear," she said, putting a comforting arm around May's shoulders. "That man of yours has more lives than a cat. He'll be back before you know it." The waiting was harder than May had expected. Every night, she lay in their empty bed and wondered where Calder was, whether he was safe, whether she would ever see him again. The baby seemed to sense her anxiety, moving restlessly and making it difficult to sleep. But May was not the same helpless girl who had once been bought and sold like livestock. She had learned to be strong, to find purpose even in the darkest times. During Calder's absence, she organized the cabin, prepared baby clothes from scraps of fabric, and even helped Mrs. Henderson deliver a baby when a desperate family arrived at their door during a blizzard. "You're going to be a fine mother," Mrs. Henderson observed as May gently cleaned the newborn while his exhausted parents rested. "You've got the instincts for it." May looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart swell with anticipation. Soon, she would hold her own child, the fruit of the love she shared with Calder. The thought gave her strength to endure each day of separation. The riders who appeared on the cabin's horizon 2 weeks later were not the same ones who had left. Marshal Stevens and Deputy Clark were notably absent, and Sheriff Morrison looked haggard and worn. But Calder was there, alive and whole, and that was all that mattered to May. She ran to meet him despite Mrs. Henderson's protests about pregnant women running, and threw herself into his arms with such force that he staggered backward. "Easy there," he laughed, holding her close. "You'll knock us both over." "I don't care," May sobbed into his shoulder. "I was so afraid." "I'm here," he murmured into her hair. "I'm home, and I'm never leaving you again." Later, after the surviving lawmen had been fed and sent on their way, Calder told May about the mission. They had tracked the killers to a hidden canyon, cornered them after a fierce gun battle. Marshal Stevens and Deputy Clark had died in the fighting, but the threat was ended. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," May said, tending to a bullet graze on his arm that he had tried to hide from her. "It needed to be done." Calder replied simply, "But you were right. I'll never forgive myself for leaving you, especially this close to your time." May smiled and placed his hand on her belly, where their child was performing what felt like acrobatics. "Well, you're home now, and that's what matters. This little one has been waiting for his father to return." As if responding to Calder's touch, the baby gave a particularly vigorous kick that made both parents laugh. Strong like his mother, Calder observed. Stubborn like his father, May countered. They were both right, when their son was born a month later. During a spring snowstorm that made travel impossible, he entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the mountain valley. "Doctor." Winters arrived 3 days later to find a healthy baby and a glowing mother, both being doted on by a father who seemed to find wonder in every tiny breath his child took. "What will you name him?" Mrs. Henderson asked as she prepared to return to her own home. May looked at Calder, who was cradling their son with the careful reverence of a man holding something infinitely precious. "Hope," May said softly. "We'll call him Hope." "That's not really a name for a boy," Mrs. Henderson pointed out gently. "Then we'll call him Thomas," Calder said, looking up with tears in his eyes. "Thomas Hope Boone, after the man whose deathbed confession gave us our freedom, and after what this child represents." May nodded, understanding completely. Their son was indeed their hope. Hope for the future. Hope for a family built on love instead of loss. Hope that the cycle of cruelty and betrayal that had marked both their lives would end with them. As the years passed, the Boone cabin became a beacon of hospitality in the wilderness. Travelers knew they could find food, shelter, and kindness there, no matter what their circumstances. May and Calder taught their growing children. Hope was joined by 2 daughters and another son, to see every person as worthy of dignity and respect. The children learned to read from May's few precious books, learned to hunt and track from their father, and learned from both parents that love was the strongest force in the world. They never knew want, never knew fear, never doubted that they were cherished and valued. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, May and Calder would sit on their porch and marvel at the life they had built together. From the ashes of suffering and injustice, they had created something beautiful, a family, a home, a legacy of love that would outlast them both. "Do you ever regret it?" May asked one such evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors, giving up the chance for a normal life in town. Calder reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of years spent together. "This is normal for us," he said simply. "This is perfect." May smiled and leaned against his shoulder, listening to the laughter of their children playing in the yard, feeling the contentment that came from a life well lived. They had saved each other, not just from physical bondage, but from the spiritual prison of believing they were less than human. In the end, that had been enough. Love had been enough. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale of love, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit in the Wild West. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening to this story, whether you're in a bustling city or your own quiet countryside. We're grateful to share this journey with you. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, romance, and adventure from America's frontier days. And share your thoughts about May and Calder's incredible journey from bondage to freedom. Retry,